The fifth and final round here on Beyond the Cage, presented by Fight Chicks. And in our fifth round, brought to you by our friends at BluegrassMMA.com. Follow them on Twitter at BluegrassMMA. We will pick the main card fights for UFC 172, which will be on pay-per-view this Saturday from Baltimore, Maryland. The first fight on the 5-fight main card will be in the featherweight division, as Max Holloway will take on Andre Fili. Looking at Fili, he is 1-0 in the UFC. He is overall riding a 9-fight winning streak. His last fight in his debut for the UFC was a victory over Jeremy Larson at UFC 166, and 7 of his 13 career victories are by knockout. Looking at Max Holloway, he is 4-3 in the UFC. His last fight was a victory over Will Cope at Fight Night 34, and 5 of his 8 career victories are by decision. Now, I think this is a little bit of a curious matchup to put on the main card, considering some of the names you have on the undercard, like a Joseph Benavidez, a Takanori Gomi, a Charlie Brenneman, and Danny Castillo are matching up against each other, but the UFC tabs kind of some of the young guns here in the featherweight division to get the final spot for the main card, and I don't know a lot about Fili. He is riding a pretty impressive streak. He has some power. Jeremy Larson, I don't believe, is in the UFC anymore, so that victory, albeit just his only one in the organization, not a great victory by any stretch in the imagination. And Holloway, he's had some success in the UFC, but he's also had some downturns. I mean, he's fought some decent competition as well, so he's definitely battle-tested at 8-3, and I think Max Holloway, he presents a lot of problems because of his length and height, but Fili is also in a very similar mode, so it's going to be interesting to see kind of whose style prevails, but I think the one thing Fili has that Holloway doesn't is that penchant for a finish, and I think the fact that Fili has been able to go out there and get finishes may be the difference in this matchup.
Yeah, Jim, I think that it may come down to time in the UFC. The victory for Fili was in the second round. That was his only fight in the UFC. And then, like you said, Max Holloway's battle-tested. His losses in the UFC are to Dustin Poirier, who's a top contender in the division, Dennis Bermudez, and Conor McGregor. Those are his losses. He has almost more octagon time than Fili has cage time in his entire career. To me, I think that will be... that may be a contributing factor to who walks out of this matchup on Saturday.
The next fight of the evening will be in the lightweight division, as Jim Miller will take on Yancy Medeiros, and Medeiros is a injury replacement for the King, Bobby Green. Looking at Medeiros, he is 0-1 with a no contest in the UFC, and that no contest came in his last fight against Yves Edwards at Fight Night 31, and 6 of his 9 career victories are by knockout. Looking at Jim Miller, he is 12-3 with a no contest in the UFC. His last fight was a victory over Fabricio Combs at UFC 168, and 13 of his 23 career victories are by submission. Unfortunately, Dave, Bobby Green, just a week before the fight, had to pull out of this one, and it kind of make things a lot different, as I think Green had a legitimate chance to beat Jim Miller, but in Medeiros, really short of a puncher's chance, I'm not sure how he beats Jim Miller, who has serviceable stand-up but is a pretty good Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, and on short notice, I gotta believe Miller's probably going to try to push that maybe more than he would have against Bobby Green, considering he will have a vast superiority in that area. And for Medeiros, I know he's taking on short notice. He's doing the UFC a solid, but I just don't see how he beats Jim Miller in Baltimore.
Yeah, I don't see how he can beat Jim Miller as well. Like you said, Jim, doing a solid will probably get rewarded for that from the UFC. But Jim Miller's a tough guy for just about anybody to fight, even with a full fight camp. But on 7 to 10 days notice, including your weight cut, it says that he trains out of Hawaii. So he's got to get over here to get the time difference, all that kind of stuff taken care of. I think all signs point to Jim Miller in this fight. If you're Medeiros, you take the fight on short notice and hope it pans out in your favor with the UFC helping you out down the road.
The next bout on tap for UFC 172 is in the middleweight division as former Strikeforce middleweight champion Luke Rockhold takes on Tim Boesch. Looking at Rockhold, he is 1-1 in the UFC. His last fight was a victory over Costa Falopu at Fight Night 35, and 6 of his 11 career victories are by submission. Looking at Tim Boesch, he is 8-5 in the UFC. His last fight was a victory over CB Dalloway at UFC 166, and 7 of his 17 career victories are by knockout. Looking up this matchup, Dave, I think Boesch has one-punch knockout power in the middleweight division, but I think he's going to have a tough time trying to get on the inside of Luke Rockhold, who is a very tall middleweight at, I believe, 6'3". Boesch is only about 5'11", and he's going to have a tough time trying to get inside on Luke Rockhold. And also because of that length, he's a very wiry guy, that being Rockhold, and he's a very hard guy to take down. So if I was Tim Boesch, I think you got to try to work for the takedown, because I think standing at range, you're going to get picked apart by Rockhold. And I think a lot of people kind of doubted Rockhold's power, but he knocked out Costa Falopu with a body kick in his last fight. And I think that proved that Rockhold's not just simply a guy that, throws, leg kicks and jabs and stays at range. This guy has some power. And if Boesch doesn't watch out, he can get knocked out as well.
Yeah, this is an interesting fight because Boesch can definitely, he can take a whooping, but still has that knockout power. Go back to the Okami fight in Japan where he was getting destroyed. But then in that third round, he had the power, the cardio, and the wherewithal to fire back and get that late knockout in the third round in one of the best comebacks in the UFC's history. That being said, I think that Luke Rockhold poses a lot of interesting problems, like you said, with the length and with the power. And he usually brings a good game plan to the table as well.
The co-main event of the evening will be in the light heavyweight division as Mr. Wonderful Phil Davis will take on Anthony Rumble Johnson. Looking at Anthony Johnson, he is actually 6-2 in the UFC, but this will be his first fight for the organization since January of 2012, and that was actually in the middleweight division. Overall, he is riding a 6-fight winning streak, and of his 16 career victories, 11 are by knockout. Looking at Phil Davis, he is 8-1 with a no contest in the UFC, currently riding a 3-fight winning streak. His last fight was a victory over Lyoto Machida at UFC 163, and 6 of his 12 career victories are by decision. This one is pretty simple, Dave. If Davis can get this to the ground, he can certainly dominate Anthony Johnson with some ground and pound, and maybe even submit Anthony Johnson, as Davis has shown that he has some pretty decent submission skills. But if it stays standing, Anthony Johnson, regardless of the weight class he fights at, has a lot of power. And I think has proved that over his 6 fights since leaving the UFC. And I definitely think has the ability to knock out Phil Davis. And first of all, if he makes weight and can stop the takedown, he can be very successful. But if he cannot do that and his conditioning is faltering at any point, because Phil Davis has proved he can go 25 minutes, Phil Davis will rack up another victory in the UFC.
The first challenge, like you said, Jim, is going to be Friday to make sure that Rumble Johnson can make the weight. How bad is the weight cut? Are we going to see an early barrage from Anthony Johnson and then have him gas out? We don't know. They had the UFC, I forgot what the show's called, but the lead up to 172, and it, had all the media members saying that at 205, Anthony Johnson poses a lot of problems and can be very dominant with his power. And all that is true. But there's a lot of stuff to get us into the octagon Saturday night. And we know Phil Davis is going to make weight. We know what Phil Davis has to offer. And this is going to be, it's a very interesting fight because a strong right hand from Anthony Johnson can shake up the rankings in the light heavyweight division.
The main event of the evening will be for the light heavyweight championship as Jon Jones once again puts his title on the line, this time against Glover Teixeira. Looking at the challenger in Teixeira, he is 5-0 in the UFC. He is currently riding a 20-fight overall winning streak. His last fight was a victory over Ryan Bader at Fight Night 28, and 13 of his 22 career victories are by knockout. Looking at Jon Jones, 13-1 in the UFC, riding a 10-fight overall winning streak. His last fight in another successful title defense, he defeated Alexander Gustafsson at UFC 165, and 9 of his 19 career victories are by knockout. I think standing up, Dave, I think that's where this fight is going to play out. Jones is definitely the longer fighter, as he is just about in every fight. He's a little taller. I would say he's probably a little quicker. Teixeira definitely has the better power. He is still pretty technically sound, and Teixeira is a machine. It may not seem like he's moving very fast at any point in the fight, but he keeps coming. He is like the Terminator because he just keeps coming no matter what you throw at him. And the interesting aspect will be to see if Jones tries for the wrestling game, which of course he is very capable of doing, and how well Teixeira defends it. So far in his tenure, Teixeira has done very well stopping the takedown. I don't think he's been on his back, but if he has, he hasn't been there very long, and that's an area, and that's kind of the X factor, I think, of this fight. And I think Teixeira can go all 25 minutes. I don't foresee that being a problem with him. It's really going to be how he's going to deal with the speed and reach of Jon Jones. It's really plain and simple. If he can get onside, he can maybe do some things. But if he has trouble getting inside and he's not seeing those punches coming from Jon Jones, he will be in for a long night.
If you remember Glover's fight against Fabio Maldonado back at UFC 153, it was in Rio. He picked Maldonado apart that entire fight. And I think, Jim, if he is unable to get inside of Jones, that's what we're going to see. Jones will be able to pick Teixeira apart for 25 minutes. If he's able to get inside of that ridiculous reach, I think that his chances improve greatly. And I think that clearly being on the inside gives him much more power than trying to pick your shots against Jon Jones. But I don't even know if he gets inside, Jim. Does Glover even want to go in for a takedown, or does he want to keep it standing? Like, there's a lot of questions out there on what Glover's could do.
Well, with that said, Dave, let's get to picks.
Cue the Pride music.
The first fight of the evening will be in the featherweight division as Max Holloway takes on Andre Fili. I think Fili has a chance because of his knockout power, Dave, but like you mentioned earlier, Max Holloway, this will be his 8th fight already in the UFC, so I'm going to go with the experience in the octagon and Max Holloway to win this one.
I will take the blessed one, Max Holloway.
At lightweight, Jim Miller will take on Yancy Medeiros. It's unfortunate Bobby Green's not in this fight. I think that had a chance to be fight of the night, but Medeiros stepping in and kind of getting thrown to the wolves. So give me the man from Sparta, New Jersey, and Miller to win this one.
Yeah, Jim, I'm definitely going to agree with all of your thoughts on this fight. It's unfortunate that Bobby Green's not there, but I'm going to take the 6-time Fight Night bonus winner, and that is Jim Miller.
At middleweight, former Strikeforce middleweight champion Luke Rockhold will take on Tim Boesch. I think Boesch will have trouble getting inside on Rockhold and will have trouble taking down the man from California. So give me Rockhold to win this one.
I will take Luke Rockhold as well.
The co-main event of the evening will be at 205 pounds as Mr. Wonderful Phil Davis takes on Anthony Rumble Johnson. Of course, Rumble has a chance to win this fight with just one punch, but Phil Davis has proved that he wins, and that's what he does in the UFC with his tremendous wrestling. So until proven that Johnson can stop the takedown, give me Big Phil to win this one.
I just want to throw it out there. I do think Phil Davis is going to win, but I want to get ahead of you on picks. So I'm going to go in the opposite direction, and I'm going to pick Anthony Rumble Johnson.
The main event of the evening for the UFC light heavyweight title, Jon Jones tries to defend it once again against Glover Teixeira. I really like Teixeira. I'm a big fan of his. I will be rooting for him, but until proven, you gotta go with the man from upstate New York in Jon Bones Jones.
Until proven otherwise, I mean, it's hard to go against him. I will pick the New York State Public High School Athletic Association state champion from 2005, and that is Johnny Bones.